Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Namaste. Welcome to Vayu Vivekananda Yoga University, the first yoga university outside India doing graduate education and research. So we are delighted you have joined us for the Distinguished Speaker Series webinar. And today we have a treat with Professor Hebbar on Buddhism in two parts. Today is part one, and next Saturday at the same time will be part two. So with that, let me introduce our esteemed speaker today, Professor Hebbar. He, again, is an eminent scholar, a brilliant scholar of Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. So he has, impeccable academic record with a PhD from Netherlands, honorary Doctor of Divinity, and a Doctor of Literature, DLit. So very, very strong academic credentials. And he has been lecturing extensively in North America, Europe, and Asia. He was the Executive Vice President of the DC Area International Buddhist Committee. He has been invited to the White House, the Pentagon. He's been featured in many documentaries on PBS and National Geographic, and many awards as well. And I'll just share at the end that he has also authored many articles and authored 3 books. He is currently the chair of Faculty Senate at Vivekananda Yoga University, our own institution, our own faculty here. He has taught in several years in the religious studies program here. And he also currently teaches at George Washington University and has taught an honors program at the University of Maryland. So again, we are really delighted and honored to have him as a distinguished speaker today. And today's topic is Buddhism, part 1. And in this, he'll be covering about basically the life of Buddha, the synopsis of his teachings, history of Buddhism in India, how it spread, various lineages of Buddhism spread in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, as well as China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet, Bhutan. So it's really a very wide spectrum that he'll be covering. And we are again really delighted and honored to have him today as our distinguished speaker. So with that, without taking further time, I will give the floor to Professor Hebbar. Professor Hebbar, welcome, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Joshi. Momentarily, I will start with a very brief Buddhist invocation prayer, and then we will get going. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. It is said usually 3 times in the service of the triple gems. The triple gems refer to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Okay, so with that, let me first load my slides, and then I will tell you a little bit about the contours of how I'm going to go about my lecture. So I'm going to first here talk about, in this particular scenario, it is in 2 sessions, and it will deal largely with the historical and sectarian aspects of the Buddha Dharma. We will talk about the core teachings, because Buddhism is divided into 3 main branches, ultimately. The Theravāda tradition that is practiced in Sri Lanka and continental Southeast Asia, namely Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. These nations follow one type of Buddhism called Theravāda. Then the second type of Buddhism is Mahāyāna, that is practiced in China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, making Vietnam the only nation in Southeast Asia to largely follow the Mahāyāna tradition. And then we have the third branch of Buddhism known as Vajrayāna. And this is the kind of Buddhism that is practiced in the Himalayan regions, starting with Tibet, Bhutan, the Sikkim and Ladakh regions of India, and Mongolia. And last but not least, in the northwest region of the Caspian Sea, in the Kalmyk region of the Russian Federation. So it is a pretty vast tradition that began, really speaking, in Nepal. And then its main ministry was in India. India was Buddhist for more than 1,600 to 1,700 years. 2/3 of the population had become Buddhist. And Swami Vivekananda also observed this. In the end, I'll point that out to you. But for now, let's get started on this material. The etymology of the word Buddha, it comes from the Sanskrit verbal root Bud, meaning to awaken or to enlighten. The term Buddha is actually a past participle. It is not a noun. It is a past participle, meaning awakened or enlightened. That's all it means. Since the term is applied to a person as an honorific title by initially his disciples and later on by his followers, the term was prefixed by the definite article the and suffixed by the impersonal pronoun one. Hence, the term Buddha eventually came to be translated as the awakened one or the enlightened one. So, really speaking, all it means is awakened or enlightened. Let's go to the 6th century BC, India of those days. India was at that point in time, particularly northern India, I'm talking about the Indo-Gangetic plain all the way to the Iranian-Afghan border. There was no Pakistan in those days, as you know. So therefore, there were 16 confederate republics called the Mahājanapadas at that time, ruling over this region. And not among actually, the 16 major kingdoms or confederacies, the 16 Mahājanapadas, was the Shakya kingdom. Today, the Shakya kingdom lies in the territory of the nation of Nepal. The capital of the Shakya kingdom was Kapilavastu in Sanskrit and Kapilavattu in Pali. So, in the 6th century BC, there ruled at that point in time a royal couple of the Shakya kingdom, King Shuddhodana and his spouse, the Queen Mahamaya. They had been married for many years and had had no issues. And one day, Queen Mahamaya dreams. But before we get into that, let's look at the layout of this map. As you can see, it's titled Buddha's India. So this was, and you can see some of those Mahājanapadas there, like the Vajjis, Kosala, and so on and so forth. Magadha particularly comes to mind here. And they have given you also the major metropolitan cities of this part of the world, some of which are either the state capitals or the capitals of the countries, such as Kathmandu and Dhaka, that you can see there, and the provincial capital Calcutta or Kolkata, and the Tibetan capital Lhasa are marked in red, and so is the Indian capital Delhi. All right, so here we are looking, going back to the situation, Queen Mahamaya has a dream in which she beholds a white elephant carrying a white lotus flower, making its way towards her. And she dreams As the elephant approaches her, it diminishes in size and enters into her mouth. It's symbolic, of course, but in Asian culture as a whole, particularly South and Southeast Asia, white elephant is a symbol of royalty, dignity, and majesty. And the lotus flower has always been a very important flower in the dharmic traditions because it symbolizes purity, even though it is surrounded by muck and water. And there's a symbolism behind that, and I'll talk about it later. Particularly, white lotus has even more of a significant meaning. And therefore, something great and splendid and spiritual was about to happen, given the context of this dream of Queen Mahamaya. As was the custom, she then, of course, she finds herself pregnant, and as was the custom, she goes or is headed toward her father's house in the neighboring kingdom, which is a much smaller kingdom compared to the Shakya that her husband ruled. But she doesn't go too far. She tells the palanquin bearers, after all, she's the queen, to stop the palanquin, that it is time for the delivery of her child. And as she alights, she catches hold of the branch of the sal tree. And she has many ladies in waiting. After all, she's a royal lady. She has no dearth for such people and attendants. And at that juncture, without causing any labor pains to his mother, the baby, whom will eventually be named Siddhartha or Siddhartha in Pali, is born. He is born not in a palace, he is born in a garden. And that garden is referred to as the Lumbini Gardens. Today, it is in Nepal. So it becomes the first of the 9 holiest places of Buddhism, which is Lumbini. And there, as he steps out from his mother's womb, we are told, according to Buddhist hagiology, that 7 lotuses popped up from the ground, and the infant, yet to be named child, Siddhartha, walks on these 7 lotuses. And as he steps from the 6th to the 7th lotus flower, he puts the index fingers of both his left and right hands upward and downward, saying that I have come down to this earth in order to teach a transcendental teaching. So right then, Queen Mahamaya comes to know of the special nature of his child. There was another incident that took place, which, of course, in the interest of time, I cannot go into. But at least the second incident I can allude to. She returns back after the birth of the child, back to her husband's palace in Kapilavastu, and the naming ceremony takes place. But within a week, today, of course, Lumbini looks like this. It's a major place of Buddhist pilgrims coming from all over the Buddhist world to pay homage to the triple gems, particularly, of course, the birth of the Buddha. I also want you to notice that pillar that you see there to the left of the building, the viewer's left, I'm saying. Obviously, from the building side, it would be to the right, but from the viewer's side, it is to the left. Just make a note of that pillar. And of course, around it here, you see the archaeological ruins in and around the building and the pillar and the pond associated with the birthplace of the future Buddha. So a week after the birth of Prince Siddhartha, and his naming ceremony has also taken place, there used to be a sage in the Himalayas. He was a genuine recluse. He was a hermit who did not interact with anybody. And even when invited, whether you be a prince or a pauper, he was not the kind of person who would accept your invitation. In other words, he was truly a recluse. He wanted to be by himself and to develop his own spirituality. That was the kind of person he was. But one day, soon after the birth of Prince Siddhartha, he appears at the palace gates of the Shakya Palace in Kapilavastu. The guards are surprised, and without a word, they let him in because he was such a venerable sage. And they quickly inform their superiors, the palace counselors, that the sage Asitadevala has arrived. And quickly, of course, they make sure that the sage is comfortably seated and hospitality is given to him. And they quickly inform the king and queen that the sage Asitadevala had arrived at the palace. The king and queen come after having paid their respects to the sage. The king musters up the guts to such a venerable man by saying, "Sir, what can we do for you?" And the sage said, "It seems a child has been born to you both. I wish to see the child." So the king promptly goes and fetches Prince Siddhartha, the newborn infant, and gives it into the arms of the sage Asitadevala. And that's the moment that has been captured for us in this painting. So the sage takes the young prince into his two hands, and then immediately he beams with delight. And the very next moment, he starts to cry profusely. The king and the queen are utterly perplexed by this contradictory behavior on the part of the sage. So again, after all, he's an extremely respected person, and King Shuddhodana again musters up his guts and asks the sage, "Venerable sir, we know that somebody can be happy and somebody can be sad, but not consecutively. Do you mind explaining as to why these two opposite emotions were expressed by you in the context of holding our dear child?" And the sage said, "No problem. The reason why I was beaming with delight as I held your son is that, look here, Your Majesty, I'm already an old man, that I lived long enough to see the birth of this child. So that's the reason why I was happy. And the reason why I began to shed tears profusely is that precisely for that very same reason, is that I'm already an old man with a flowing beard, gray beard, that I shall not live long enough to see this young child grow up to be a great spiritual teacher at whose feet I can sit and learn the great teachings he's about to impart to the world. And that is the reason why I shed tears. At that juncture, the king and the queen knew, together with the incident that had taken place at his naming ceremony, that their son was no ordinary son. So this is the incident of the sage Asitadevala at the birth of Prince Siddhartha. Siddhartha does grow up, get married. Of course, I have to skip all that because we have a tremendous amount to cover. And we come to the stage when he is made up his mind that the kingdom that he is about to inherit from his father is not his principal desire. His principal desire was to go and seek the answers to the spiritual questions that had been troubling him for quite some time. So at the age of 29, he leaves the royal palace and goes to the banks of the river Anoma that still runs in Nepal to this day. And there, at the banks of the Anoma River, which is also the territorial marker of the Shakya kingdom, in other words, the end of the Shakya kingdom, he not only takes off all of his royal garments and presents it to his charioteer, saying, "This, I have no further use for this." And he dons on the saffron robes of an ascetic, and he cuts off his hair with a sword. He was, after all, born into a Kshatriya family, the royals of Kshatriyas, and having then symbolically cut off his hair as a symbol of renunciation, he then crosses the Anoma River and renounces not only all his claim to the Shakya kingdom, but also of worldly desires and material possessions. And that's the moment that has been captured for us in this painting that you see here. He wanders about for 6 years. The renunciation having taken place in the year 534 BC. The Buddha's birth took place in the year 483 BC at Lumbini. So, having wandered at the various places, seeing many teachers, and hearing what they had to say, he eventually comes to a place called Gaya, which is today located in the Bihar state of India. There, under the base of the Bodhi tree, he makes a resolution that he will not get up from the base of this tree until he has found, to his personal satisfaction, all of the answers to the questions that had been plaguing him over several years about the whys and the whereoffs of human suffering and the spiritual resolution toward the end of such sufferings. It is said that the person who sat down at the base of the tree as the mere monk Gautama. He was Siddhartha Gautama. The Gautama was the family name, the patronymic. He arises on the full moon day of the month of Vishakha or Vaishakha as the Sammasambuddha in the year 528 before the Common Era, or 528 BC, as it is commonly known. So soon after his enlightenment, after 7 weeks, today the place of his enlightenment looks like this. You have temples from all of the Buddhist countries located in this area. It is jointly governed by several groups: the Archaeological Society of India, the ministry that deals with these matters from the government of India, the Mahabodhi Society, and all of the Buddhist nations have their temples in and around this area. This huge figure made of stone that you see there in that place was presented by the government of Japan, which is a very devout Buddhist country. They follow not only Buddhism, but the native religion of Japan, which is Shinto. They follow both. So anyway, ever since then, this area, soon after the enlightenment of the Buddha, has been known as Bodh Gaya in order to distinguish it from the Hindu portion of Gaya, which has the temple of Gadadhara, Vishnu in the form of the mace holder. So there's a big distinction between Bodh Gaya and the Hindu portion of Gaya. So anyway, this is the Vajra seat under the Bodhi tree, the very same Bodhi tree under which the Buddha attained enlightenment. So this is at the backside of the statue, on the side of the Mahabodhi temple as it stands today. And again, it becomes the second major pilgrimage center for all Buddhists after Lumbini, which is the place of his birth, and now Bodh Gaya, the place of his enlightenment. So soon after his enlightenment, 7 weeks later, he comes to Hinduism's holiest city, the city of Varanasi. And there, in the gardens of the Sharanganatha temple, which is a Shiva's temple, in the grounds, shortened to Sarnath, there he delivers his very first sermon under the Bodhi tree to anybody who will listen to him. 5 independent recluses who had been traveling together seeking a master, a spiritual master, are the first 5 people to come and listen to him. The beginnings of great things are usually very small, and Buddhism was no exception to that. So these first 5 disciples were the first people to accept the Buddhist teaching, and they are highly admired and adored by the Buddhist world to this day. So what did the Buddha teach in his first sermon at Sarnath, located in the present-day Uttar Pradesh state of India in the year 528 BC? He talked about 4 things: the 3 marks of existence, the 12-fold wheel of causality, the 4 noble truths, which form the theoretical side of his teaching, and ultimately the practical side of his teaching became enunciated in the Noble Eightfold Path. So these four teachings go back to the time of the Buddha himself, and they form the fundamental basis of Buddhist philosophy and ethics. And these four teachings are followed by all Buddhists, regardless of which branch of Buddhism and which particular sectarian group within those traditions that they belong to. In other words, these four teachings are common to all Buddhists. Over and above that, you have variations depending on which branch and sect of Buddhism that you belong to. But that's a different story. That's a later addendum to these four core teachings. So then Sarnath becomes the third holiest place of Buddhism after Lumbini and Bodh Gaya. Sarnath looks like this today, again maintained by the Archaeological Society of India, and you can see Buddhist pilgrims around this reliquary mound referred to as a stupa or a dhatu garbha. So I will tell you who built this stupa. It looks quite ancient, as you can see, and again maintained by the Archaeological Society of India. So this gives you an idea. And when people go in the Buddhist world, when they come on pilgrimage, they usually wear white. And that's the reason why you see everybody dressed in white near the stupa. I have to talk to you about these two disciples, very eminent disciples of the Buddha. They are referred to as Shariputta and Mahamoggallana in Pali. In Sanskrit, their names would be Shariputra and Mahamoggallana. These two young men came from within the Brahminical fold. They were Brahmins who had disciples of their own. Each of them had 500 disciples. They were eminently learned. And at one point in time, while attending the Hilltop Festival, something, a kind of a premonition came to them that what is this world all about? The spiritual questions that seem to plague every seeker seem to have come to them as well. And they both decided, they were actually first cousins to each other. They were children of sisters, and they both decided independently to renounce the world and go seeking a spiritual master. They did seek a spiritual master, but it was not the Buddha. And having sought the spiritual master, they still were not satisfied. They eventually heard about the Buddha through many of the sources that they had come to be acquainted with. And then they come to the Buddha. And eventually, they, after hearing his sermon, request him that they not only become his disciples, but his monastic disciples at that. And the Buddha at that point in time told them, you have another master, so go seek his permission before I accept you. And the very fact that the Buddha said that made him even more attractive to these two young men. And then they not only decided to become his disciples, but all of their disciples also became disciples of the Buddha. If they had outlived the Buddha, they would certainly have been the leaders of the Buddhist Sangha. But unfortunately, both of them predeceased the Buddha by 6 months. They died 15 days apart from each other. One on the new moon day of the month of Kartika, and the other one on the full moon day of the month of Kartika of the year 484 BC. 6 months later, the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha himself took place in May of 483 BC. So today, the mortal remains of Mahamoggallana and Sariputta lie enshrined at Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh, at the famous Sanchi Stupa. I'll tell you who built the stupa. Keep that in mind again. It was certainly not built at the time of their cremation. But this then becomes, in the sequence of things, the fourth holiest place of Buddhism, after Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, and Sarnath. Each, of course, representing one aspect of the life of the Buddha. There were many, many incidents in the life of the Buddha, but I will narrate to you one or two of these very important incidents that took place in his lifetime. In the city of Shravasti, today located in the Uttar Pradesh state of India, in Pali, that same place is called Savatthi. The Buddha used to often come there. And in that city, there was an extremely wealthy rice merchant who went by the name of Sudatta. But of course, he also had an acronym and a name with which he went by. People called him, and that was the name Anathapindaka. And I'll tell you how and why he was so called. And since he was a man of enormous means, he one day was visiting his sister and brother-in-law. And his sister and brother-in-law would normally, as soon as he entered, await on him hand and foot. Wealthy people like that, and he was no exception to that rule. And he then saw this time that his sister and brother-in-law, quite busy doing other things of embellishing and cleaning their house, rather than paying any attention to him. And then he said to his sister and brother-in-law, "Do you realize that I'm here?" And they said, "Yes, please be seated. We know you're here, but we need to take care of certain things." Of course, he's never been treated that way before. And Sudatta then says to his sister and brother-in-law, "Stop. Take a break. I need to know what's going on here. This is quite unusual behavior on your part." And they said, "Well, a great teacher of whom we are disciples, known as the Buddha, is coming with his monastic retinue to our house tomorrow in order to seek alms for dana. And therefore, we are trying to make our house as presentable as is possible. So we'll be with you shortly. And Sudatta then said, I got to see this for myself, who this person is. And of course, he stays there. That's after all his sister's house. And the next morning, when the Buddha arrives with his monastic retinue, Sudatta is struck by his charisma of that great spiritual leader. And after hearing his sermon, he decides to become a disciple of the Buddha. But he's not going to become a monastic disciple, but just a lay disciple. In the Buddhist world, a lay woman and a lay man are referred to as upasika and upasaka. The Buddhist community is usually made up of four: monks, nuns, layman, and laywoman. Bhikkhu, bhikkhuni, upasaka, and upasika. So he just wanted to become an upasaka, a layman. And that is fine. The Buddha admitted him into the Buddha Dharma as an upasaka. And of course, he was not the kind of a man who would just sit quiet. He immediately started to pester the Buddha that he could do something for him. After all, he was an extremely wealthy man. And the Buddha said, look here, I was once a prince and I do not need anything. So thanks, but not thanks for your kind offer. Even as Sudatta was haughty, there was a good side to him. He was generous to a fault towards the poor and the destitute. He had built many charitable institutions and organizations in order to help them. And that's how he earned this title, this little nickname, Anathapindika, one who cares for the destitute, the anatha. So he took that same attitude toward the Buddha too. He wanted to serve his new spiritual master. So finally, since this person would never take no for an answer, the Buddha said, look here, if you are that interested in getting something for me, my monks come and meditate at a particular grove not too far from your sister's place. So if you want to get that area for my monks who want to meditate there and would like to have their huts and dormitories built, you can do that. But if that proves to be too arduous for you, you don't have to do it either. So I'll give you that option, a way out as well. But no sooner the Buddha had given him this ordinance, Sudatta then goes about immediately to find out who possessed that piece of land. He finds out that that piece of land belonged to a royal, a Prince Jeta by name. So he goes to Prince Jeta and says, I want this piece of turf. And Prince Jeta, seeing the desperation on Sudatta's face, then tells him, and even sees a business opportunity, if you will, and says, look here, you can have this land. It's not a problem. I'll sell it to you. But the price of the land is as follows. Whatever amount of turf that you want, you would have to fill the entire turf with gold coins. So that's the price of this land. And then it's all yours. And Sudatta was so wealthy He says, is that all? That's not a problem. So he orders from his treasury cartloads of bags containing gold coins to be brought one after the other, and has his underlings empty out these pouches containing gold coins, as you see there, and spread it right across the entire turf that he wishes to possess and buy from Prince Jetha. And that's what you see him do here. And then Prince Jetha looks upon this as this is being done, and suddenly he tells him, Sudatta, stop. And that's this scene that you see here captured for us. Stop. Tell your servants to stop spreading these gold coins. You're really serious about this, aren't you? Why are you buying this land for? And then Sudatta spills the beans and he says, I am the disciple of a great spiritual master, the Buddha, and I want to donate this land to him and his monastics so that they could build their dormitories and meditation halls at this place. And Prince Jetha says, it is all yours for free. I too am a disciple of the Buddha. So therefore, please take back all your gold coins. I do not want a single cent, a single piece of gold from you, as you're about to donate it to our common spiritual master, the Buddha. So that is the story of Sudatta. And he gives it to the Buddha. The Buddha names it Jetavana Vihara in honor of Prince Jetha. Today, that place is in Savatthi. And the place where the Buddha had kept his hut looks like this today. The remnants, the archaeological remnants of where the Buddha used to stay. Today, Buddhist pilgrims from all over the Buddhist world come and pay their homage as a place of pilgrimage. So then it becomes, in the sequence, I guess, the fifth great holy place of Buddhism after Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, Sanchi, and now Savatthi. So the exact spot of where the Buddha's hut used to be, his dwelling place at Savatthi. This is another incident in the life of the Buddha that I thought is worth narrating. There used to be a flower girl in the kingdom of Kosala, which is today also located in the Uttar Pradesh state of India. There, Mallika and her companions, as flower girls, their humble job was to go and in the morning and pick flowers from the various public gardens of the kingdom of Kosala, and then take those fragrant flowers to the flower market and then sell them to the flower merchants, who would then make bouquets and garlands and sell it to their customers. So this was the routine. So Mallika and her companions were out and about their daily chores that morning. and they see the Buddha coming with his retinue of monastic disciples on the alms round, the dana round, that is still followed in the Buddhist world to this day. So as they were coming on the alms round, Mallika and her companions see the Buddha and his disciples. So they had packed some lunch for themselves, and they quickly decided that they should donate this lunch to the Buddha and his monastic disciples. So they quickly approached the Buddha and offer it as dana into the alms bowl, the patto, that is given to every Buddhist monk at the time of his ordination, monk or nun for that matter. So anyway, as Mallika put her alms into the patto, the alms bowl of the Buddha, and her companions did so to the rest of the retinue, the Buddha merely smiled at her and said, "By nightfall you shall be a queen." And of course, these teenage girls very respectfully smiled in return, and then of course laughed, because how can a flower girl who is in act nobody suddenly become the queen of the land? It would be a pretty tall order in that regard, a tall becoming. It is a little far-fetched. But then the Buddha went about his way after saying that, and he disappeared with his retinue. Mallika and her companions just went about their business. And then they saw the handsome king of Kosala, the king Prasenajit, or in Pali as he is known, Pasenadi. Prasenajit was coming back from a victorious battle, and he sees the beautiful Mallika. And he tells her, "I have fallen in love with you. Will you be my queen?" And indeed, he wants to go to her father to ask her hand in marriage. So, just as the Buddha had predicted, by nightfall, she did indeed become the queen of Kosala. Mallika is now the queen of the land. Of course, she is in the palace. She is a very devout Buddhist. And every day, what she does is she calls 7 Buddhist monastics to her palace, where she personally cooks the meal and serves them. This was her daily routine. Then in one of those occasions, when these 7 monastic disciples had come for their dana, one of the palace counselors quickly calls the queen, saying, "There's something urgent that you need to attend to, Your Majesty. Could you please come and take care of it?" And since it was urgent, or what seemed to be seemingly urgent, Queen Mallika then takes temporary leave of the 7 monastics, talking to the head monk over there and saying, "I shall soon be back." And that's the moment this captured for us. "But I will let one of my ladies in waiting to serve you, even as I go and take care of this matter, and I'll be back shortly." And of course, the lady in waiting, she's nervous, and in her nervousness, her hands and palms become quite sweaty, and the dish in which she was serving the monks slips from her hand and falls, and all of the dish is now on the floor that you see there. Queen Malika returns to see this. And of course, she's unhappy, but she does not scold her maid. She knew that she was nervous. And the reason why the dish broke is that when you serve the monks, you do not serve it in any kind of ostentatious vessel, not gold, not silver, not any metal. It has to be earthen. That's the rules of the Buddhist Vinaya. So therefore, she quietly not only seeks pardon for some frivolous thing that she had been called for, that she sees in hindsight, and she starves herself for 7 days for depriving the monastics of the food that she was about to serve. So that was the nature of Mallika's discipline as a devout upasika of the Buddha Dharma. So that's the story of Queen Mallika of Kosala. Another important incident that took place during the lifetime of the Buddha now is in the kingdom of Kosambi. Both Kosala and Kosambi were one of the 16 Mahajanapadas of the time of the Buddha's India. There, the ruling king's wife was a lady by the name of Queen Samalati. Queen Samalati had a hunchback maid by the name of Kujuttara. Kujuttara's daily routine was to make sure that after the queen had gotten up, to open the windows, sun and air the queen's chambers. Then, after making the bed, to burn incense, make the place fragrant, and then go to the market, fetch fresh flowers, and ornament the queen's chambers with those fragrant and fresh flowers. So every day she did this, and the queen had allotted her some money to do this on a daily basis. So one day, Kujuttara comes back from the flower market with her basket of flowers that you see there. And then, as the queen is seated in an adjacent chamber, giving audience to many people, Hunchback Kujuttara comes and seeks an audience with Her Majesty. And what she does is she gives the queen change, spare change. Then you see the queen stretching out her palm, her right palm, and then asking Kujuttara, "What is this you're giving me?" And Kujuttara said, "Your Majesty, today when I went to the flower market, I heard the sermons of a great spiritual master whom many people refer to as the Buddha. And having heard his sermon that day, I decided to come and give this change back to you. So what? What has that got to do with this change? So then Kujuttara explained herself. Your Majesty, I know you had allotted me some money every day, but I never used to come and put back the change in the box. I used to keep the money for myself. I used to steal it. In other words, I used to embezzle the funds that you had allotted me after buying the flowers, of course. Samavati was surprised at this. And she says, Kujuttara, I'm not interested in this change. You can keep it. But what I'm more interested in is who this person was who created such a profound moral transformation in you. I'm more interested in that. So what you're going to do for me is you can go and fetch the flowers every day. And as long as this spiritual master is there in town, your job is to go and listen to his sermons and come back to me and summarize for me the sermon that he had delivered to you for that day. That is your job. So for the next 110 days in which the Buddha was there at Kosambi, the hunchback Kujuttara very dutifully comes back every day and relates to Queen Samavati the summary of what the Buddha had sermoned upon that particular day. She always began the summation of that sermon with the phrase iti vutuka. Iti vutuka in Pali means and thus he said. So that collection of 110 hymns eventually came to be called iti vutuka and later on got embedded into the Buddhist scriptures when it was formed. So that is the story of the maid Kujuttara and Queen Samavati. Another incident in the life of the Buddha was the story of this young lady by the name of Vishaka. Vishaka was the daughter of an extremely wealthy merchant. And he was a good Buddhist, but had gotten married into another wealthy family of the house of Migara. Migara was a giant, and every day at the time of her serving her father-in-law, which she did very dutifully, like a very obedient daughter-in-law, a Buddhist monk would come for the alms seeking. Migara, being a very devout giant, said, we give alms to our own ascetics, and therefore, please send this monastic who seems to come to our door from the Buddhist faith, send him away. So Vishaka, you see, promptly did that in obedience to her father-in-law's wishes, even though she herself was a devout Buddhist. So what she does is she would starve herself every other day for having denied the Buddhist monk of his alms. So one day her father-in-law notices this of Vishaka, and he comes to her and says, were you not angry for my telling you that you ought not to serve the monastic at the time of my meal? And Vishaka said, no, I'm not angry with you. I am following the rules of the household of which I am the daughter-in-law of. Migara seems to have been completely changed by the very pious and obedient way in which she balanced her duties with her own personal religiosity. And Migara himself eventually came to accept the religion of his daughter-in-law, and he became a Buddhist. So this is the story of Vishaka. And Vishaka, of course, eventually, she became almost the female version of Sudatta. She became a great benefactress to the Buddha Dharma during her lifetime. And she is regarded as one of the great upasikas of the Buddha Dharma in the history of Buddhism to this day. Going to the very last event in the Buddha's life, in the interest of time, there are many, many stories associated with him, but we got to move on. The Buddha had an attendant, a personal attendant to him, a monk by the name of Ananda, in the last 28 years of his life. Ananda would always tell the Buddha, Master, you must die in a place which is an extremely well-known place. And the Buddha said, no, I'm going to die in a place which no one has heard of. So in the last days of his life, the Buddha chooses a place called Kushinagara, or as it is also known as Kusinara, about 30 miles from the city of Gorakhpur in the Uttar Pradesh state of India. There, between two sal trees, but the Buddha asks his monastic disciples to lay his low bed so that he can deliver his last sermon, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, and eventually pass on into history. At that juncture, where the Buddha was about to deliver his last sermon, an old man by the name of Subhadra, or Subhadra in Pali, comes trudging towards the Buddha and says to him, Master, can I sit near you? Because I wish to hear your sermon, your last sermon, and I'm hard of hearing. So may I sit close to you? And Ananda says, how dare you ask for such a privilege when many of his monastic disciples and people who have served him for years, as well as many lay people who have served him, are piously and patiently waiting, and you request this special treatment. And the Buddha says, Ananda, stop. And that's the moment you see captured here. Let Sudatta, who has come from afar and who is old and hard of hearing, sit near me and hear, exhibiting thereby Buddha's not only a sense of wisdom, but also his sense of compassion toward anybody who he hardly knew. So he then passes away on the full moon day of the month of Vishakha, the very same month he was born in, but a different year. This time, the year is 483 BC. And there, Kushinagara then becomes one of the 9 holiest places for Buddhism. I would say, in this case, the 7th holiest place of Buddhism, because the other 2, last 2 holy places, come in the post-mortem phase of the Buddha's life. Today, that place looks like this, with a metallic image of the Buddha lying in the Mahaparinirvana pose in the temple associated with the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha. And again, this is a place where you have a steady stream of Buddhist pilgrims throughout the year from all over the Buddhist world. The place where the Buddha was eventually cremated, a stupa was built there. It was referred to as the Ramabhara Stupa. And it is not too far from the place where he passed away. Here you can see Buddhist pilgrims being talked to by a guide explaining the cremation scenario of the Buddha. And also you can see 2 Buddhist monastics making the circumambulation of this particular stupa. Soon after the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha, which took place in May of 483 BC, the Buddhist monastic community felt it was time that the teachings of the Buddha be rehearsed and put into writing as soon as possible before they become corrupted or even lost for posterity. So the Buddhist Sangha then decided, the monastic community decided, that for the 4 months of the rainy season, from July through October, July, August, September, and October, the 4 months, the Chaturmasya of the rainy season, that they would meet outside of the city of Rajagaha, which was the capital of the kingdom of Magadha, one of the 16 Mahajanapadas. And there they would bring together what would become eventually known as the First Buddhist Council. For this purpose, they elected 500 of their most learned brethren and sisters to become delegates to this First Buddhist Council. The purpose of the First Buddhist Council was to rechant and rehearse the teachings of the Buddha, and then eventually reduce them into writing. For this purpose, they called upon 3 monks who were well endowed to do this. One was the monk Ananda that I had already talked to you about. He was requested by these 500 delegates to rechant to the best of his memory all of the general didactic sermons of the Buddha. Then the second monastic was the Buddha's senior-most disciple, the elderly Upali. He was asked to rechant all of the monastic rules and regulations that the Buddha had laid out for the Buddhist monastic community. And then the Buddha's most intelligent disciple, Mahākashyapa or Mahākasapa was asked to deliver, to the best of his ability, all of the most difficult metaphysical sermons that the Buddha had delivered during his lifetime. Given his stature and status, Mahākasapa was also elected as the president of the First Buddhist Council. The end result was the formation of the Buddhist scriptures. Here you see a scenario of the artist's depiction of the proceedings of the First Buddhist Council. You see the 500 delegates, and you see on the dais Mahākashyapa right in the center. To his immediate right is the monk Ananda, and a little bit closer to us and is seated the elderly monk Upali. And you see one layman sitting there. He's the only one who has hair, sitting close to the monk Upali and without any sort of headgear. And that is King Ajatashatru, the ruler of Magadha. When King Ajatasattu heard that these people, the monastic community, was meeting in a cave outside the capital city of Rajagaha, he came running and paid his respects to the Sangha and said, "Why did you monastics not tell me that you're meeting here? I would have built a pavilion for you to hold this synod, this conference." And the Buddha's community monastics said, remember, the Buddha had laid down the rules that we are not supposed to ask for anything. It is the duty of the lay people to find out what our needs are. And that is followed to this day in the Buddhist monastic communities throughout the world. It is the lay people who run the temple. The monastic community merely looks after the spiritual affairs. So Ajatasattu, realizing his shortcomings in this area, quickly built, in the remaining time that he had, a pavilion and consecrated a stupa there in which they could meet. So every day after the day's proceedings were done, many groups like this that you see here would sit around a master scribe, where the underscribes would write down what had been ratified by the 500 delegates to then become part of the Buddhist scriptures. So this is one such group, one such scenario. It's not the only group. So they used to put all of this on palm leaf and then put these palm leaf manuscripts in little boxes that you see there. And all of these little boxes would then be collected and put in one massive giant box. So therefore, since there were three monastics who delivered the three aspects of the Buddhist teachings, they came to be put in three major boxes. And therefore, they were referred to in the Tripitakas. Three is three in Pali, and Pitaka means box. So three boxes, that became the nomenclature of the Buddhist scriptures. So the Tripitaka looks like this today. The ones that Ananda had chanted in front of the delegate of 500 people or monastics came to be referred to as the Sutta Pitaka, which was divided into 5 groupings or nikayas: the Digha Nikaya, the long sermons; the Majjhima Nikaya, the medium length sermons; the Samyukta Nikaya, which is the connected sermons; then the sermons associated with length, each graded, came to be referred to the Anguttara Nikaya, and those sermons that could not fit into these 4 categories, Digha Nikaya through Anguttara Nikaya, then came to be put in a separate miscellaneous group, which actually became much bigger than all the 4 put together. And that 5th Nikaya came to be referred to as the Khuddaka Nikaya, itself being divided into 15 books, starting from the Khuddakapata, the Dhammapada, the Udana, and particularly I want you to take a look at number 4, Itivuttaka. Remember Queen Samavati's hunchback maid Kujuttara, her 110 sermons became part of the Itivuttaka. The Sutta Nipata, and so on and so forth, including the Jataka tales and the Theravāda and the Theravāda. So all of these that you see as part of the Sutta Pitaka were Ananda's contribution in terms of the ratification of the Buddhist scriptures. What Upali, the person who is responsible for the monastic code, that collection came to be known as the Vinaya Pitaka, which was itself divided into 5 books that you see there. And then the most difficult sermons that the Buddha delivered, which the monk Mahākassapa, the Buddha's most intelligent disciple, rechanted, became known as the Abhidhamma Pitaka, with 7 books that you see there. So these are the Buddhist scriptures which were put together in the first Buddhist council. A century after the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha, unlike the people who were there in the first council, who were the contemporaries of the Buddha, who had seen him, who had discussed with him, who had debated with him, these people were different. They were at least 4 generations removed from the time of the Buddha. We are talking about the year 386 BC, when certain issues cropped up within the Buddhist monastic community as to whether we should follow all the rules and regulations to the T, or certain amendments and relaxations could be made, and certain matters of interpretation of doctrine had also crept up. So when these issues reached a particular point, the Buddhist Mahasangha then decided that it was time to call for what became eventually known as the Second Buddhist Council. This took place at Vaisali or Vaishali, located today in the Bihar state of India. There, the Mahasangha elected 700 of their colleagues, of their most learned colleagues, monks and nuns, to serve as delegates to the Second Buddhist Council. The purpose of this council was to sit and dialogue and sort out the 15 points of controversy that had come about, 10 of them dealing with Vinaya issues, in other words, monastic discipline issues, and 5 of them associated with matters of Buddhist doctrine. The end result was not too good. Buddhism split into 2 groups. The ones that said that we cannot make any relaxations, any amendments, came to be referred to as the Theravāda group. In other words, they were the conservative group that said no changes. And the ones that said, yes, changes can be enacted and new interpretations given, that came to be known as the Mahāsangika group, or the liberal group, that said, yes, that we can make these amendments and changes. So actually, the Mahāsangika was actually in the greater group of people. In other words, they were in the majority. The Theravāda were in the minority. So the site of the Second Buddhist Council today, the archaeological remains that you see, the stupa there, and I again want you to note that pillar, that column, okay, which I've been trying to tell you. Just note it and I'll tell you who built that. You see a circumambulatory path. So then Rajagaha becomes the 8th holy place of Buddhism, and finally the 9th holy place of Buddhism is Vesali. So both Rajagaha and Vesali are post-mortem. In other words, after the time of the Buddha, after the Mahaparinirvana of the Buddha. So this is the end result of the Second Buddhist Council, the conservative Theravāda and the liberal Mahāsangika. But as to what happens in the history of Buddhism is something very dramatic. It changes the whole course of the religion. That happened in the personality of this young prince called Ashoka, 304 to 237 BC. His grandfather was Chandragupta Maurya, 340 to 298 BC. He was the first person, the first monarch to bring all of northern India. I'm talking from the Afghan-Iranian border in the west to the Burmese border in the east. This vast swath of territory across the Indo-Gangetic plain under the rulership of one single ruler, namely himself, and the Mauryan Empire came to be established. What were the reasons why this Mauryan Empire came into being in the first place? About a few years prior to the establishment of the Mauryan Empire, Alexander the Great had invaded India all the way from Greece. He had come across the Hellespont, crossing into what is today Turkey, or in those days known as Asia Minor, into the Levant region, which is today occupied by 5 countries: Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. Having captured the Levant region, goes into Pharaonic Egypt, Egypt that was being ruled by the pharaohs, up to the Libyan border, then returns back across the Levant region into what is today Iraq, and then confronts the mighty empire of the Achaemenids of Zoroastrian Iran. And ultimately he defeats the Iranian king, the last king of the Achaemenid dynasty, Darius III, after defeating him and having conquered Iran, Zoroastrian Iran, he moves into Afghanistan. And from Afghanistan, the next country to the east is India. There he confronts the Indians at the Battle of Jhelum in 326 BC. And having defeated the king of the Punjab region, Porus or Purusha, he wants to advance further into India. At that point, every time he wins the battle, his soldiers would cheer him on. Let's go on, Your Majesty, to the next destination. But this time, after the Battle of Jhelum, despite their being victorious, his soldiers fall silent. They do not cheer him on. And Alexander calls all of his generals into his tent and asks them why this change in attitude among the soldiers. And they tell him, Your Majesty, you have brought them too far. The aim was to destroy and completely conquer Zoroastrian Iran, and that has been achieved. There was no need to come into Afghanistan and to the borders of India. They wish to go home. So Alexander then quietly understands his situation and reluctantly packs his bags, sails down the Indus River into the delta, where it empties out into the Arabian Sea, and then heads back into the Persian Gulf, where today Oman and the United Arab Emirates are located. Makes his way up into the delta, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers that serve the nation of Iraq, and there at Babylon, he contracts malarial fever, and before he's about to pass away, he lived only for 33 years, very young he died. He calls all of his generals into the tent and divides up his empire among them. The area from what is today the Syria-Iraq border in the west, all the way to the Indus River, that includes Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and what is today Pakistan. That entire territory he gave to his junior-most general, Seleucus. Seleucus, after the death of Alexander, then takes on the task of what his master had not completed. So he attacks India again, this time in the year 303 BC. And the Indians had learned their lesson, and they were now united under the aegis of the Mauryan Empire. And Chandragupta Maurya defeats Seleucus. Not only does he defeat Seleucus, he gives his daughter in marriage to Chandragupta Maurya and sends an ambassador to the Mauryan court at Pataliputra, modern-day Patna. And that ambassador is Megasthenes. So Chandragupta Maurya passes away in the year 298 BC. He is succeeded by his son Bindusara, who ascends the throne in 298 BC. And Bindusara is not as charismatic as his father. He's merely a caretaker king. And he sees there's some trouble brewing in the northwestern regions of the Mauryan Empire. So what he does at that juncture, he sends all of his generals to take care of that situation. And of course, they all come back as failures. They're not able to take care of the situation. Then he sends, except for the crown prince, he sends some of his other older sons to see if they can take care of the situation. They too come back as failures. And then he reluctantly approaches one of his junior sons, who people, including Bindusara, would much rather keep away from. He had a very bad reputation, as such that people refer to him as Chandashoka, or the ruthless Prince Ashoka. He would, with his own band of royal thugs, pillage, loot, and rape within the aegis of the Mauryan Empire itself. He was a person whom his own brothers would keep away from. That was the kind of personality Ashoka was. So he reluctantly approaches Ashoka to see if he could take care of the situation. Ashoka is delighted to help his father. So he goes and takes care of the situation. He doesn't care for friend or foe and returns back victorious. And Bindusara then tells Ashoka, meets him halfway and tells Ashoka that I have decided to give the Mauryan Empire to you because all of your older brothers did not seem worthy of the great empire that your grandfather had put together. Ashoka is delighted to hear this. Fortunately, of course, he lets his own father die a natural death, but he does something else. He takes care of all of his older brothers and younger brothers so that there is no competition later on. And then, upon the death of King Bindusara in the year 273 BC, Ashoka ascends the throne of the Mauryan Empire as Emperor Ashoka. Of course, he's not going to sit quiet. He wants to expand the territorial turf of the Mauryan Empire. So what he does with that in mind, he sends emissaries to the Deccan regions, which is the only area that is independent now, with a choice. Either the local king ruling there accede his turf to the Mauryan Empire, or the Mauryan army is going to come and confiscate the turf and make it part of the Mauryan Empire. Most of them, when they receive the emissaries from the Mauryan emperor, have a better head on their shoulders. And they all said that we will accede our kingdom to the Mauryan Empire. At least Ashoka will then let us rule as this local governor over there. But there was one kingdom that refused to do that. And that was the kingdom of Kalinga, today geographically contiguous with the modern state of Odisha. When the emissaries tell Emperor Ashoka that Kalinga was one kingdom that refused to bow to his imperial ambitions, Ashoka had never heard of this before. He doesn't know whether to laugh or cry. He says, go ahead. If that is what they want, let us join them in battle. And the Battle of Kalinga takes place in the year 256 BC. 150,000 people are slain on the battlefield. And Ashoka is certainly victorious. He's surveying the area as a great victor. And as he's surveying, purely by happenstance, he overhears the sermons of a Buddhist monk, comforting one of the bereaved families on the battlefield. Ashoka likes what he hears. He sends for the monk and he says, "Hey monk, who is your head of your Sangha? Ask him to come and meet with me." And the monk obliged, and he went and reported it to his head monk, who happened to be the Venerable Moggaliputta. Moggaliputta comes to the tent of Emperor Ashoka, and Emperor Ashoka says, "I like what your monk was saying. And could you come and explain to me in my capital the details of the Buddha Dharma?" And Moggaliputta said, "Yes, I will do that, Your Majesty. But in advance, I'm going to send a party of people who will come and brief you before I come and lay out the full teachings of the Buddha to you in detail." And Ashoka said, "That's fine." There at Pataliputra, he is awaiting the first delegation. And the first delegation is headed by a young monk, barely about 15 years old. And the way he carries himself impresses Ashoka. He is frozen. He doesn't know how to even begin the conversation with the young monk, even as he welcomes him. The dignified appearance, the decency, and the enormous decorum with which he conducts himself impresses Ashoka. And Ashoka, in order to break the ice and start the conversation, tells the young monk, "It looks like I have seen you someplace before." And the young monk replies, "Of course you have seen me someplace before. I'm your nephew. I'm your brother's son. When you were power hungry and got rid of all the competition and got rid of all your brothers, my mother was pregnant with me at that point in time. And the palace servants took pity upon her and whisked her away from the back alleys to the safe confines of the Buddhist monastery where I was born. And when I grew up, my mother told me the circumstances of my father's death. And then I decided to enter the peace of Buddhism." Ashoka is now full of tears, tears streaming down his cheeks, and he's shaking and shivering with shame. And he tells the young monk, "Are you not angry with me for what I did?" And he says, "That is not how we are taught to behave, especially monastics. And therefore, that whatever you have done is part of your karma." So at that time, Moggaliputta enters that scene and is shown in skits in a very dramatic way. And Ashoka then goes down in his knees in front of the head monk Moggaliputta and says, "I wish to repent my horrible deeds that I have done, the horrible life that I have led, and wish to enter into the peace of Buddhism." So Moggaliputta says, "That will be done by your own nephew accepting you into the Buddha Dharma." So, with his own nephew presiding over the ceremonies, and in front of Moggaliputta, Ashoka utters the Tissarana. The Tissarana is, "I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha." And that triple refuge He is the beginning of every Buddhist service throughout the Buddhist world, whether it's Sri Lanka or Japan, Mongolia or Vietnam, it does not matter. It is once not only acceptance of Buddhism, but on a weekly basis prior to the commencement of every Buddhist service. From that point onwards, Moggaliputta Tissa tells Emperor Ashoka, until now you are not my disciple, but now through your nephew you have become my disciple. And the first thing you're going to do is go to the women and children of Kalinga who are prepared to fight a second battle against the Mauryan forces and ask their apology. In other words, apologize to them. And Ashoka, as the emperor of the subcontinent, goes down on his knees in front of the women and children of Kalinga and says, from now on, I will not only give up battle, but I will only have a defensive army, not an offensive one. So, and from that point onwards, it's a 180-degree turn in terms of what Ashoka was, in terms of his persona, to what he became. He became such a devout Buddhist that he literally emptied the imperial treasury in the service of Buddhism, with the result that Buddhism grew by leaps and bounds during his time. He becomes a very benign monarch in terms of opening up hospices and dispensaries for the wounded and the sick. He lines the roads with trees. He adopts certain environmental policies. He was the most modernistic emperor for his time, given. So from what he was, Chanda Ashoka, he becomes the Dharma Ashoka, the righteous Emperor Ashoka. And literally his ministers have to hold his hand and say, Your Majesty, we know you love Buddhism, but we have to run a country. So be generous, but again, keep in mind that we have to run a nation. So that was the nature of Emperor Ashoka. He passes on in the year 237 BC, but prior to his passing on, I wanted to show you certain maps. This is Alexander's empire to his generals. And as you can see, from what is today the Syria-Iraq border in the west to the Indus River in the east, was the domain of Emperor Seleucus, okay, which Alexander had given. And here you can see the kingdom of Seleucus that goes across all of Zoroastrian Iran and Afghanistan. And Alexander had named many of the major cities of Afghanistan in his own names. Kandahar was known as Alexandria Kandahar and Alexandria Herat. Herat is a city near the Afghan-Iranian border. And of course, Seleucus kingdom to the east bordered the Mauryan Empire. And you can see Takshashila or Taxila today in Pakistan, and Sagala or Sialkot, okay, and so on and so forth. So this was the scenario around the defeat of Seleucus by Chandragupta Maurya in the year 303 BC. And that is Ashoka's empire. His edicts are being found even to this day, being uncovered by the Archaeological Society of India. And you can see where Kalinga is. Only the southernmost regions of India that had not become part of the Mauryan Empire. Otherwise, from the Iranian border in the west to the Burmese border in the east, the entire area. And you can see some of the Vedic names that you see there for the 5 rivers of the Punjab. Vitasta is the Vedic name for Jhelum. Asikni is the Vedic name for the Chenab. Then Shutudri is Satluj. So, and Sindhu, of course, is the Indus River. These are all tributaries of the Indus. So Ashoka's empire. And what had happened is, we have to note, Ashoka just a decade before his own passing, he did not like what had happened to his beloved Buddhism in the Second Council of being split into the Theravāda and the Mahāsangika factions. So in order to reconcile that and look into the possibility of something like that, in the year 247 BC, 10 years before his own demise, he calls together what becomes known in Buddhist history as the Third Buddhist Council. It takes place in his own capital, Pataliputra, and this time with imperial patronage. Buddhism is able to elect 1,000 delegates to the Third Buddhist Council, monks and nuns who become delegates, the most learned of them. And there, Ashoka sets the agenda by saying to Magali Vuttatissa, who heads the council, that two agendas we need to keep in mind. One, to look into the possibility of reconciling the two factions, the conservative Theravada and the liberal Mahāsangika. And the second agenda is to look into the possibility of spreading Buddhism outside the land of its birth, namely outside of India. The first agenda was a total failure because Ashoka wanted to bring these two, but unbeknownst to him, in the zeal of a convert, he threw all of his patronage behind the Theravada tradition. With the result, the Theravada tradition received all of the boost and the fillip that it needed, and the Mahāsangika tradition felt ignored, and they moved away from the frontiers of Ashoka's kingdom. So that's why the first agenda was a total failure. The second agenda was not only a success, but a smashing success. Ashoka's own children, his son Mahinda became a Buddhist monk, and his daughter Sangamitta became a Buddhist nun. And they took Buddhism to the only land to the south of India, the island of Sri Lanka. And not only it went to Sri Lanka, he sent delegates into neighboring Myanmar, what is Burma in the east. And Burma in those days was a land that was in enormous turmoil and banditry and so on and so forth. And Buddhism brings enormous peace and prosperity to the land. Seeing what had happened to neighboring Myanmar, the Thais become interested in Buddhism. So they send for monks from India, from Sri Lanka and Myanmar. And one particular day, the entire Thai royal family converts to Buddhism. So Buddhism spreads into Thailand. And the kind of Buddhism that is spreading is the Theravada tradition. So, and then from Thailand, neighboring Cambodia becomes interested in Buddhism. And there, Thai monks go and spread Buddhism into Cambodia. Seeing the alarming advance of Theravada Buddhism into continental Southeast Asia, Vietnam, that has always seen itself as the guardian of Southeast Asia, then goes and takes Laos, the only landlocked nation in Southeast Asia. But the Lao people are ethnically related to the Thais. They are nothing but mountain Thais. So the Laotian king goes and seeks refuge in Thailand. And then it is the Thais, the Laotians, and the Cambodians are barely able to keep the Vietnamese at bay. And eventually, Vietnam also becomes Buddhist, but they receive their Buddhism much later. But for right now, Buddhism has spread right across continental Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. All of these nations to this day are Theravada Buddhist. And even the southernmost regions of Vietnam, near the Mekong River Delta, is also Theravada. But most Vietnamese belong to a different form of Buddhism. I'll tell you which one down there. So that was the great success of the Third Buddhist Council. And today, you see, The legacy of Emperor Ashoka is in the seal and the official insignia of the modern Republic of India. The Ashokan seal that you see there, I've been asking you to take note of all the pillars. All the pillars in the 9 holy places of Buddhism were set up by Emperor Ashoka. And on top of each was the lion capital that you see there, which got adopted on the 26th day of January 1950 as the official seal of the Sovereign Democratic Republic of India. And so also was the Dharmachakra of Ashoka, which today stands in the center of the Indian tricolor, the national flag of the Republic of India. So this is the legacy behind which Emperor Ashoka left for the modern nation of India. So Theravāda Buddhism, we will look into it, but today, these are the Theravāda Buddhist countries, and they remain so to this day. Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and a small area of Vietnam. Geographically, that looks like this to this day. Okay, so these are the Theravāda Buddhist countries. And we will talk more about what this Theravāda Buddhism is all about shortly.